Um, all right, I've got some announcements for us. I'm Dave, the president of Wake Audubon. And I have announcements for us for now. Um, and then I'm going to hand it off to our guest speaker. So, first up, like always, we have lots of bird walks coming up. If you are interested, make sure you check out the calendar on our website or our meetup group. So you can RSVP. A couple walks coming up are at Bass Lake and Hilltop Needmore. And we have another event over Memorial Day weekend on Saturday, May 25th. Our educational outreach chair, Larry Zoller, is going to be giving a talk at the Oberlin Regional Library on declining North American bird populations. That's in the afternoon on the 25th. And you can check out the link to register for that. And then I want to hand it to Jeff real quick to talk about our annual Wildathon, 25th year. Is that right?
Hey, Dave.
Great.
Counting every bird of the species.
Where are you going?
Put me side into the sand hills and coast plain and
So just to repeat real quickly for those on Zoom, Jeff and Stephanie will be doing our annual Wildathon fundraiser. They will be trying to identify as many species as they can over the course of 24 hours. And if you'd like to pledge towards that fundraiser, reach out to me or to Jeff and get you linked up with that. We're so thankful for them doing this for 25 years now.
the nation.
Jeff's just noting that you can also donate online. So we have some volunteer opportunities coming up. We are still looking for a conservation committee chair. If you're interested in that, you can reach out to Mary Abrams, who's holding that down for us right now, but would love to hand it off. You can also reach out to Mary if you are interested in our habitat certification program, which we are planning to launch. So we need volunteers to help us design and get that program up and running this year. And then we're coming pretty close to the close of the festival season, but we do have one more coming up at Out Raleigh Pride on June 22nd. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to Rick, who is organizing that tabling for us. I have one final reminder about Lights Out for the spring season. So Lights Out still runs from May till May 31st this year. Remember to turn off your outside lights from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. And we've been having a pretty active advocacy campaign over the spring season. If you're interested in volunteering for that, either now or thinking about the season coming up in the fall, please reach out to the email handle lightsoutwake@gmail.com. And then we don't have any first timers in the room. But if you are joining us online for the first time, we will sponsor your first year of membership in Wake Audubon. So let us know in the chat and we'll get connected to you so that we can do that. It comes with membership with the National Audubon Society. It's a great deal. And then just coming up in June, Pollinator Week is coming up June 17th through the 23rd. There'll be different events around for that, so keep your eye out for it. And John, you have an announcement about purple martin banding?
I'll say something about it. I want to mention too about pollinators that the museum has a new exhibit opening up. So on the 14th of June will be a kind of a preview for the public if you want to participate in that. That'll be presumably here in this wing. We're in the Nature Exploration Center. Also in June, as you know, we've been doing some purple martin nestling banding over the years, and I will continue that with Courtney and John Connors. Emma Blackford at Prairie Ridge, our new director, also did a lot of banding in her previous lifestyle. So we will be doing some nestling banding on June 19th at Prairie Ridge, 9 to 11. Then again on June 22nd over at the Faculty Club, assuming that all the that the weather holds and the eggs hatch and everybody's doing things on time. And last year was pretty a different season. Martins took a real hit. But anyway, keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on the website. We'll get things updated now that I just got these things set today with Emma and Courtney, the dates and times. So we'll get things updated. And yeah, so hopefully we can see you at one or the other. All right, thanks. And anything else? Yeah. The which? Oh yeah, I got it. Are we ready?
We're
Are
ready.
we anymore? All right, we are set. I got my info. There's Ann back from the front door duty. So it is a pretty rainy night, not only in Georgia, but Raleigh and all over. So, we're kind of lonely here in the A-level basement, but we got a lot of snacks. So I guess that means Jeff and I get to take extra home. And well, and tonight we have Emily Nastis here to speak about her PhD work on the Henslow Sparrow. So she's a PhD candidate over at NC State. I have a few things to tell you about her. So she studied the ecology and is currently looking at the genetic structure of this population. She's in the process of analyzing the DNA data right now. She got her biology, BS in biology, and you also did the BFA at Virginia Commonwealth, so that's in fine arts, right? At Virginia Commonwealth. You were with Leslie, right?
Yeah.
So Leslie is a colleague of mine who worked on golden ring warblers years ago, and so we've and I actually did some training for some of Leslie's other students on proprietary warbler stuff when they were doing some tracking, learning how to put tracking devices on. And anyway, Emily went to Virginia Commonwealth University, and then after graduating there, she did some science communication work with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And so with the BFA degree, she was doing scientific illustration. So I think that's pretty cool. I like to see the blending of science and art. And then she came to NC State to do the graduate program. After, finishing, she should finish in August, September, and then hopes to go on and do work with conservation of threatened species, vulnerable habitats. And because she's now computer literate, she has what is developing what we call spatial models, which is using the computer graphics and a geographic information system to help us understand how animals occur and utilize the landscape. That's a big area for doing what we do to do predictive things with animals on the landscape and then do conservation work. So she also, oh my gosh, she loves coffee. So do I. She loves traveling. So do I. How about that? Funny how bird people are. And she likes painting, birding, backpacking, and climbing. So it's a real pleasure to have Emily speak to us tonight. Oh, one last little story. When she was getting started, she had to learn how to bleed a bird, and it was right in the middle of the pandemic. And nobody was allowed to do anything except me, because I don't pay attention to rules, right? So, but her advisor is a federal employee. He couldn't do anything, and NC State was in lockdown. But my yard was wide open, so she came over to my backyard, and we caught some birds and showed her how to take blood from a bird. That's where we met. with her and her professors, Jaime Coyaz at NC State, and off we went, and here she is. So good to have full circle come back.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna, oh, host has disabled screen sharing.
Oh, give me just a second. Sorry about that.
That's okay, thank you.
You should be able to now.
Okay. All right, so I'm sharing a purple screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Then. Okay, am I sharing the presentation screen now?
Yep.
If someone would do me a favor, if you can't hear me online, unmute and let me know, because I'm gonna be stepping just a little bit away from this computer.
Will do.
Thank you. Okay. And you guys can hear me okay, right? What happened to my screen? That's weird. Okay.
So gremlins, little, it's the rain. It's the flood.
All right. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you again for that introduction, and thank you guys so much for inviting me here today. It's always really great to be able to share about your research. So as John said, my name is Emily Nastis. I am a PhD student at North Carolina State University. This is my last year. I'm wrapping everything up right now, so I'm going to share with you some of our preliminary results that we've picked up over the past, 3-4 years now. And yeah, my project is on the Henslow sparrow populations in North Carolina, and we are assessing the demography, their habitat use, and their genetic structure. So I have a lot to share. So I'll go a little bit more into my background before I jump into the research. As John was saying, I worked in science communication before I started my PhD program, and it was a job that I really loved, but I realized I wasn't getting to do any of my own science. I was just communicating other people's science. And so that's what prompted me to want to return to grad school and do my own project. And because birding was what had gotten me interested in the sciences to begin with, just again, as John had said, back at VCU when I was an undergrad, I had the honor to study with Leslie, and she taught us about the preplanetary warblers, and it was a really inspiring research project. So that really opened the floodgates for me. So when I got the chance to study at grad school, I was so excited to get to work on a bird project. So I ended up at NC State with my advisor, Dr. Jaime Coyazzo. And yeah, we're working together on this special bird, the Henslow sparrow. This is our protagonist in this journey. If you're unfamiliar with the Henslow, it's a grassland specialist migratory songbird. Henslow sparrows, I'm gonna get into their background before we get too far into this, because I think their natural history is a really interesting story, and it definitely contextualizes why we're doing this research. The Henslow sparrow is a grassland specialist bird, and so it relies on some really specific habitats. Back in the day, it was believed that there are 2 subspecies of Henslow sparrows that were separated in their geographic breeding range. We had the western henslowii subspecies that was found in the prairies and plains out west. And then we had this eastern subspecies called the Susurrans henslowii. And they were found along the Atlantic coastal states in salt marsh habitats. And as humans moved through the landscape, they clear-cut forests and opened up agricultural fields. And over time, they actually sort of paved the way for these 2 subspecies of Henslow sparrows to merge in their breeding ranges. So in the early 1900s, we have what we believe is sort of the heyday of the Henslow sparrow, like the largest breeding extent that we've seen for the species. And unfortunately, that did not last forever. So this is a much more modern range map for Henslow sparrows. This was compiled by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology using their eBird data. And you can see that that range has really dramatically shifted to the west, and we're not really seeing populations along this coast anymore. It's believed that that Suceron subspecies has been extirpated throughout most, if not all, of its original breeding extent. Interestingly, though, there is 2 sites in eastern North Carolina that breeding Henslow sparrows will come to each summer. That's what this little inset map is here. These sites are the Voice of America Game Land, so that's abbreviated VOAGL, and the Voice of America Transmitting Station Site B. Their sister sites, they both used to be radio broadcasting facilities. One was decommissioned and is now owned by the state, but the other one is still an active radio facility. And both do harbor populations of Henslow sparrows. And from the map, you can see that these populations in North Carolina are really far from the remainder of the species breeding range. So that, in conjunction with the widespread population declines that we're seeing for the Henslow sparrow throughout its entire range, sort of prompted this work that we're doing here with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. The population declines for Henslow sparrows. We're seeing it throughout most of their range, although there is a portion in the southwest area of their breeding range that do appear to be increasing over time. That's the blue pixels on this map here. And these population declines that we're seeing are largely attributed to the loss of its breeding habitats. So habitat fragmentation, fire suppression. These grassland habitats are not very common. So unfortunately, they are not managed for very often. So that brings us to the benefits of prescribed fire. We'll talk a little bit more about fire a little later in the presentation, but I wanted to introduce it here to emphasize its importance in these types of grassland ecosystems. Prescribed burns are really beneficial to grassland species because the fires will reset the early successional habitat. It returns nutrients back into the soils. It encourages biodiversity, and it maintains that grassland state as opposed to allowing woody encroachment into the system. So prescribed burns are a really beneficial tool for maintaining grasslands for a species like the Henslow sparrow. So now to introduce our study site. This property is called the Voice of America Game Land. This is the VOA site that is owned by the state. So the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission acquired this property after the federal facility was disbanded. And as I said before, it was a radio broadcasting facility, which is why there's that really old building in the landscape. But it's been completely deserted and it's falling apart. They just haven't taken it out of the site. 10 or 20 years ago, you would have seen these massive radio towers on the landscape because again, this is where they would do broadcasts out of the country. But those towers have been removed. And so now the property just looks like what you're seeing here, this really vast, open, grassy habitat with some roads that kind of cut through it. The site is currently managed using prescribed fire. So right now the commission has divided up the property into what they refer to as management units. It might be a little hard to see on the map, but they're labeled A through F, and there's 6 of them. And based on their current management rotation, they burn about 1/3 of the property each year. So just for a quick demonstration of what that might look like, the commission would burn maybe units A and F together in 1 year, and then B and E together in 1 year, and C and D together in 1 year. So you can see that after 3 years, the entire site has been burned 1 time over. But within the site, we have this mosaic of burn histories. So the vegetation structure is going to vary slightly in each of these units, depending on when it was last burned. All right, so that was a lot of background about Henslow's and our field site, but what are we actually doing in this research? So we are working with the commission to just gather baseline information on these populations of Henslow sparrows. Because there are only 2 sites in the state that these birds come to, and because the species as a whole is suffering pretty dramatic population declines, the state is really interested in assessing the vulnerability of these birds. And so we want to use our data to guide species management and keep them coming back year after year. It's a really special species, and we think they could be lost to North Carolina pretty quickly without the right management. So to address this, we are essentially structuring this project as a species status assessment. And to do this, we are looking at the Henslow sparrow's resiliency, redundancy, and representativeness. And sounds like a lot of jargon, but these R's are sort of the underpinnings of how Fish and Wildlife Service conducts their species status assessments. So when I say we're looking at resiliency, we're really interested in looking at the demographic rates in the population. So their abundance, their growth over time, their reproduction, how is this population doing? And then we're also interested in looking at the Henslow's relationship with the habitats that they use here in North Carolina, because we want to understand why they're coming back to these sites. What makes the Voice of America sites so special to Henslow sparrows? As for redundancy, we're really talking about spatial redundancy here. So that is to say, if some catastrophic event were to happen to these VOA properties and the Henslow populations are wiped out, does that mean that there are no other Henslows in North Carolina? Or perhaps there are other populations nearby that we just don't know about? Henslows they're hard to detect sometimes, and they're known for being opportunistic and for colonizing new grasslands when they're available. So we do think it's possible that there could be more populations of Henslows outside of the Voice of America sites that we just don't know about. So to address this, we were assessing species distribution in the region. So we were searching for other populations of Henslows nearby. And then finally, representativeness is really just a fancy way to say we're looking at the genetics. We're trying to see how different or similar the populations in North Carolina are to the other Henslow sparrows throughout the breeding range. You saw from that map I showed a minute ago that the North Carolina birds are quite far geographically from the other populations. So that right there kind of suggests that there might be some genetic divergence that's happening. Maybe there's not a lot of gene flow between these birds. But also we're really interested to see if that eastern subspecies still exists. There has not been a genetic assessment of this species to know if there are two distinct subspecies currently. So that's something that we're going to be looking at. So I'll go through each of these questions separately and kind of share some of the preliminary findings that we've got. As I said, this is our 4th year on this project, so we do actually have some stuff to share, which is really exciting. So our first question, just how are these populations doing demographically speaking? Our first big question is, how large are these populations? We need a frame of reference. So we conducted point counts at the 2 VOA properties. So this figure here on the left, figure A, we're looking at the Voice of America game land. So again, that's broken up into 6 management units. Those are divided by the black lines. And then figure B is the active federal broadcasting facility. The tricky part about site B is that it is an active broadcasting facility. So those radio towers are transmitting on site. So unfortunately, we didn't have full access to the property. We could only survey around the perimeter where you're far enough from the towers where you're not going to get fried by the broadcasts. Yeah, they actually tell you that when you go there. They say, they give you an RF meter and they say, if this thing buzzes, you need to get out of there. Yeah, so that was a really interesting experience, but we did our point counts at all of these blue dots that I have on the maps. So we had a lot more point count stations at the game land because we had, unlimited access to the game land. But at site B, we could only put out 18 point counts in the further fields from the towers. At site A, we have a 13-year data set on these point counts, which was very fortunate. The commission has been conducting them since 2011. So we have a long-term data set at site A. At site B, we only have 3 years of data, basically from when I started the project. So we have 2021 to 2023 as our data set for site B. So when we put those data into our models, we're looking at site A right now. We're seeing that the population abundance, first of all, is actually surprisingly large currently. If you can't read those numbers, on the left, I have an abundance estimate of singing males of the properties, and it ranges from 0 to 500. But our most recent estimate is that at site A, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400 singing males in 2023. We only estimated males because they're the ones that are easily detectable. So they're the ones that are perching up and they're singing their little hearts out. Females are much harder to find. They're quiet. So we really just modeled the male population here. So if you assume that, maybe there's a 1-to-1 ratio of males to females at the site, we're talking about a substantial number of Henslows that are currently at the Voice of America game land. And over the 13-year data series, we're estimating that growth rate, the gray line, at about 16% annually, which is a pretty big deal for a threatened songbird. Now, I didn't include the site B population estimates because I only have 3 years of data, but I will tell you that those estimates from 2021 to 3 are about a third to a half the number of singing males that we're seeing at site A. So in 2021, we had 126 males, but then in 2023, we had 183 males that were detected. So also a pretty large population, but much smaller than the game land. So a little bit of background about the population that we have here. I heard that several of you went out to the VOA site last week, so you got some firsthand experience with our historian out there who did a lot of Henslow Sparrow monitoring a couple of decades ago. His name is John Wright. He bestowed upon me his data set from the 90s, where he went out to sites A and B and counted the singing males that he observed. And when we just plotted his data set, this is what we found, was that site A, the blue line, always seemed to have a higher count of singing males compared to site B. So clearly there's some differences between the two properties, even when they were both the same radio broadcasting facilities. Also worth noting, these populations are fluctuating. They're increasing and they're dipping over time, but they seem to be fluctuating together. So population size increases at one site, it increases at the other, and same with decreases. So we don't know what's driving these population changes over time, these increases and decreases, but we can say that because these two sites are fluctuating together, it seems that there's some external factor at work here. So one possibility is overwintering survival rates. If birds on the wintering grounds have a really bad year and we're seeing a lot of birds die along the Gulf Coast, you're going to have fewer birds return to the breeding sites everywhere, right? So that's one hypothesis that we're looking into, but we do not, unfortunately, have data across the whole species range. So that's not something we'll be able to address in this project, but something else we're seeing with our demographic surveys is that we have a pretty high site fidelity with the banded birds that we've deployed out there. So I need to preface this by saying we didn't do a rigorous marker capture study. So the numbers I'm sharing here are just based on the observations that we've had while we were in the field. But of the birds that we put color bands on, we found that between 22 and 38% of those individuals would return in the following year, which is a pretty high number, especially because the Henslow sparrow is actually not a species that's known for having high site fidelity. Most previous studies that I've read have had very, very low success with getting recaptures of Henslow sparrows. So either something is really unique about the Voice of America site that is attracting these birds to return year after year, or perhaps other studies have underestimated the site fidelity that's occurring at other sites. Of those birds that did return, nearly 80% of them were found within 200 meters of where we captured them previously. So not only are they returning, but they are returning to nearly the same spot that we found them the year prior. So they're very faithful at this particular property. Yeah, these birds can be pretty predictable when you go out to monitor them. So in addition to the high return rates that we're seeing, we did monitor birds from mid-April to the end of July for 2 years. And we found no observations of natural mortalities occurring in the population. So I need to mention, that's not to say it didn't happen, but most of the birds that we observed were observed every week for a 15-week period, and they were fine and color banded. And so we could definitively tell who that bird was, right? But we did have a few birds that would vanish periodically, and we don't know if that's due to temporary immigration or maybe they're moving to a new nesting site. We didn't have eyes on the whole property, unfortunately, so I couldn't say where some of these birds went. But right now we're seeing pretty high survival rates during the summer season, so that doesn't seem to be a limiting factor for these birds. The next really important question we had was, what does breeding productivity look like for these birds? Because that would have pretty significant implications on population size over time. You know, are they producing enough chicks to sustain the growth rate that we're seeing at the site? So here's just some cute pictures from in the field. The image on the left is really just to give you a feel for what you're up against when you're out there in the field. I can't emphasize enough how difficult it is to find these nests. So we searched for 2 years to find Henslow sparrow nests, and we found a total of 27, which I'm very proud of because it is so hard to find these little birds out there. Of the 27 nests we found, 24 were successful at fledging at least one young. So that is a pretty high success rate. Of the nests that fledged, we had an average of about 3 to 3.3 chicks that fledged per nest. And we saw evidence that these birds were conducting multiple broods in a summer. We confirmed several pairs successfully fledged at least 2 broods with time to spare. So I do think it's possible that they could be doing a 3rd brood at this particular site, although that was not something we ever confirmed. But all of that's to say is that they are really cranking out these chicks. You know, they're coming back to this site and they are very successful with their reproduction. When we ran a nest survival model, we found that the overall survival probability of a nest for an average 24-day nesting cycle was about 82%. So that's also pretty high as well. And if you break that down into, you know, the egg portion of the cycle versus the nestling portion of the cycle, the egg portion is more vulnerable than the nestling portion based on our model. You're more likely to be predated in the egg stage rather than the nestling stage. So with that, we found that the main driver here of survival was that it was increasing with nest age. Yeah, so that was a quick overview of some of the demographic work that we've done so far. So our next question is, you know, why are these birds coming to these properties? So what is it about the vegetation that they like here? This was also a really big question to ask. So we tried to break it down by looking at 3 different scales of vegetation. So we're looking at a broad scale pattern in habitat use across the site. And so that was to see where bird density maybe changed across the sites. But we were also looking at the home ranges of birds to see if home range size had any discernible patterns in it, depending on where the birds were, and also nesting vegetation. We wanted to know what's happening at the micro habitat level that the birds need for the nest sites. So on the broad scale, again, apologies if you can't see the axes here, but we're looking at the Henslow sparrow density at the property based on the time since burn of the management unit. So the x-axis, you have either 0 representing a unit that had not been burned previously. You have 1 as in 1 year post-burn, 2 is 2 years post-burn, and then 3 and 4 years post-burn. And so really what we're finding is that management units that had been burned 2 years prior seem to have the highest densities of sparrows. And this was across all 6 management units over a period of 7 years. We found this pattern emerge where time since last burn 2 had the highest densities, and then time since last burn 1 and 3 had the next lowest, followed by 0 and 4. So this is showing us that the Henslows are responding to the fire management regime, and they seem to prefer the time since last burn 2 area because that's what they're occupying. We also found that bird densities were not uniform across the site, so they seem to show some locational preferences within the property. So really what we found was that management units A and B, so on the north and the east portion of the property, they always seem to have the highest densities of sparrows, where units E and F along that western portion, those always seem to have the lowest. You know, if you go out to the property, it kind of makes sense based on the landscape features that we're seeing out there. So units A and B, they have some of the biggest areas of grassland open space. They're also away from the major roads. So along that western perimeter and the southern perimeter of the site are 2 fairly large roads. And so we think the Henslows are maybe demonstrating an avoidance of man-made structures and non-grassland space. Units E and F also have quite a bit of wetlands and some woody encroachment that's coming in. So again, this is speculation, but that's the pattern that we've seen, is that the units are not equal as far as bird density goes. And then finally, we found the density is increasing over time, although that wasn't exactly a surprise when we saw, you know, how large the population was getting in recent years. So of course, density is going to increase. Here I'm showing you 2 graphs to really just kind of drive home this relationship that I just described. So I'm comparing 2 different management units where we have unit A on the left and unit C on the right. And time is on our x-axis, and the numbers that are represented above those points, that indicates the time since last burn status of the unit in that year. And so to walk you through unit A was burned in 2016. So in 2017, it was 1 year post-burn. 2018, where we have a spike in density, that was 2 years post-burn. And then density dips again when we get down to 3 years post-burn. And then it ramps up again as we get to the 2 year post-burn in 2022. And then unit C, which wasn't burned until 2018 for the first time, it also shows a spike in density in that 2 year post-burn in 2020, and then again a spike in 2023 in that 2 year post-burn. So different units, different parts of the sites, but really when we look at these densities, the birds are really keying into that habitat structure based on the time since last burn. So moving down to our lower level habitat pattern, we were looking at home range sizes and the bird movements of the property. To do this, we were looking at, we were radio tagging 20 to 25 sparrows each year between 2021 and 23. And we set up automated telemetry grids on 2 parts of the property to collect our bird movement data for us. So again, that map on the right is showing you that we worked in units A on the north part of the site and unit C on the south part of the site. We were hoping to compare home ranges between 2 different parts of the property that again have like different burn histories and different landscape features. To do this automated, we had to build radio telemetry towers. That's what that center image is right there. And so once you have your radio tower established and your grid set up, as the birds move through your grid, they transmit to the grid transmits to the tower, and the tower transmits to me. So all of it's automated. It's a very cool way to collect data. It's very passive, and you get millions of data points. So it was a little overwhelming to try to make these home ranges after that. So here's a quick example of what some of those home ranges looked like in 2022. Again, we did the work in 2 different units, so that's what our imagery is showing you. And each colored blob is a different bird on the site. You can see that they have similar size home ranges. I mean, they averaged 2.6 hectares, which was a surprisingly large size for such a small bird, I would think. But you can see that adjacent males that we tagged had a lot of overlap between their neighbors. These are not distinct territories that are highly defended and you know, they're separated from each other. These birds are packed in there and they're on top of each other and they're constantly squabbling with each other and chasing each other around. It was really interesting to get to monitor them and then also get this passive telemetry data to look at. So yeah, so that's what we're finding with these home ranges is that they're surprisingly large and the birds seem to be responding to some of the natural features in the landscape as well. It might be a little hard to see because the maps are so small, but there are some roads and creeks that run through the property. And a lot of the birds very clearly stopped their home ranges on the edges of these creeks and the roads. Like they, you know, we tagged a few individuals on one side of the road and they really stayed on that side of the road. So yeah, so that was really cool to see how they're responding to the landscape itself. And then finally, on the microhabitat scale, we wanted to assess nest site vegetation and understand what vegetation do these birds need at this site to have successful nests. This might be the most important feature that the VOA provides for these birds is adequate nesting sites. So we found, just in a nutshell, that these nest sites were significantly different in structure from the average vegetation throughout the property. So basically, we did all of these vegetation surveys from top to bottom throughout the site. And a lot of parts of the site actually end up looking like this image on the screen. So this is not ideal habitat for Henslows. This is, you know, pretty woody and it's overgrown and there's not as much grass in this particular part of the property. So you'll get a lot of that, especially on the edges of the site. And so birds are not selecting this. They are selecting the really nice, large grass patches for their nest sites. And so, yeah, so nest site selection is definitely being made on a broad scale in that way. We also compared nest site structure to a random location that was sampled just 50 meters from the nest. The idea here was to see, you know, like within these large grass patches, are birds really selecting something significant within that patch? And really we found that there was no difference between a nest site and a randomly selected location that was 50 meters away. So they're placing their nests in grass patches that are so large that it's just like a sea of grass and their nest could be anywhere in there. And then also we found that nest sites were not significantly different between the nests that were successful and the ones that were unsuccessful. We hypothesized that maybe some structural feature would cause predation to be more likely. You know, maybe one nest has more cover than another or taller vegetation than another. But that didn't really come through in the models. Couldn't really differentiate between those. But I will add that we only had 3 unsuccessful nests, so our sample size was very small. So I would love to see more nests found and to really expand this data set. All right, moving on to our next big question. Are there other places in North Carolina that Henslow sparrows will breed at in the summer? So to address this, we had 2 different strategies for how to select survey sites in 2021 and 2022. We were setting out acoustic recorders at grasslands in the Coastal Plains region. And all of these were sites that were determined to have suitable vegetation for Henslows. You know, we use land cover data, we use historic species records to indicate that they had been there in the past. You know, we were using a few different variables to overlay in our spatial models, and we found this whole suite of sites to survey. So in 2021, we prioritized I guess what I would call the low-hanging fruit in the region. So like the really big sites that we had easy access to, they're owned by the state or they're owned by the feds. And we definitely prioritized sites that had historic records of Henslows. In 2022, we changed the game and we decided to look close to home. So you can see there's two like really large clusters of reporters that are grouped together. Those are surrounding the two VOA properties where the current populations are. We were thinking that, the VOA populations might be acting like source populations and overflow individuals, or, colonizers would leave from the VOA sites and go to nearby grasslands. So all in, we searched 80 different sites in Eastern North Carolina, and we had no detections of Henslow sparrows. Yeah, we thought for sure we'd find someone somewhere. Like it seems very unlikely that there would only be 2 sites that these birds come to. And I guess I should say, there could be other sites that these birds are breeding at, and maybe we didn't search it, or maybe we didn't put out enough recorders, but to the best of our knowledge, the VOA sites are the only properties that these birds breed at in North Carolina presently. So this is another part of our work that could definitely be expanded. I'm sure there are other sites. Land cover changes pretty rapidly in the region. Logging areas are being clear cut, and the Henslow sparrow is a very resilient species as far as we can tell. So it's possible they could colonize other areas, but we were unable to find them. All right, so moving on to our genetics question. Are the North Carolina Henslows genetically distinct from other populations of Henslows? And I think more specifically, we do want to know if that Susurran species exists in North Carolina. This was a photo I borrowed from a really nice article written by Brian Watts, where he really outlines the natural history of Henslows and sort of the population declines that we were seeing with that eastern subspecies. So in this image, we're looking at the eastern subspecies on the left, that's the Susurran's bird, and on the right is the western subspecies, henslowii. And you can see that morphologically, there are definitely some differences between the birds. The eastern subspecies has a larger bill. It's thought that this larger bill could be the result of a different diet from the different habitats that it's occupying. Alternatively, salt marshes might be hotter than prairies or grasslands in the Midwest, and the larger bill is an effective way to dissipate heat while conserving water. So there are a few theories about what might cause these morphological differences between the subspecies. You can't really see it in this image, but the eastern subspecies is also thought to have slightly darker plumage as well. So that's a really great visual to keep in mind. So to assess the genetics of these birds, we were really interested in sampling across the species breeding range as best as possible. That way we could compare the genetic structure on an east to west gradient. So we were doing our best to collect blood samples from extant populations. So we have a lot of blood samples from North Carolina where we were working. We also had some collaborators in Ohio and Pennsylvania that were able to get us blood samples from existing populations. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of people studying Henslow right now. And getting access and getting researchers to help us collect DNA was pretty difficult. So where we were unable to get DNA samples, especially west of here, we supplemented our collection with museum specimens. So we would search the database and find individuals that met our specifications and request topads be sent to us from different institutions. The North Carolina Museum actually donated 3 topads to our cause, so that was really great. You'll also notice that we have quite a few samples along the wintering range. That was just kind of a bonus project that we were doing. It's not actually part of my dissertation to do any work on the wintering range, But I did get connected with some really nice, enthusiastic researchers along the Gulf Coast, and everyone was very willing to help us get DNA samples. So we have this repository of samples, and I'm hoping that after this dissertation, we can do a migratory connectivity study between the DNA on the breeding range and the DNA on the wintering range, and see if we can figure out where these populations are going in the winter. That would help fill in more information about the bird's annual cycle. So the other pictures I have on here are just kind of, from the lab when we did the DNA extractions. It's not really glamorous. It's just a lot of pipetting. And then this was a snapshot from one of the machines down at LSU when we were running some of our DNA through some imaging software. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't have anything else to share about the genetics. We have sent our DNA off to be sequenced, and we actually just got it back last week. So we are trying to get that analyzed in the next month. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have something really interesting to share in the next few weeks. But as of now, we just got our data back, so this is all pretty fresh. And with that, I'll start to wrap it up by saying that, these populations, they seem to be doing pretty well. They're abundant, they're growing over time, they're reproducing. As far as we can see at the site, things look nice, but we do know that their situation is precarious. There's only 2 sites in North Carolina that they come to, and they're both managed. One is managed with fire and one is managed with mowing. And if management were to cease at either of these properties, I think Henslow's would disappear from North Carolina pretty quickly. So we're really hoping that our data can go a long way to helping management really keep these birds around. And yeah, that's all I have for you. So I want to thank you guys so much for coming out here, especially those that made it out in the rain. And then a big thank you to my advisor, Jaime Coyazzo, and John Carpenter from the commission, and everyone who helped with this project. And for everyone online, I'm happy to answer questions, and you're welcome to email me if you want to follow up with anything as well. So yeah. We have a question in the room. Yeah, so the question is, are there predators at the Voice of America sites? I think snakes are going to be the biggest one, and small mammals as well. And some of the nests that we had like eggs that would disappear. So to me, that's an indication that a small snake maybe got into that nest. We didn't have any nests that were completely torn apart, which would indicate a mammal was really going into it. So it's hard to say what else would go for them. There are some hawks too that would maybe predate the adults, but we never witnessed anything like that.
Hey, Emily. We have a question from Erla, who asks, what other bird species are there at VOA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Voice of America site is a very special property. It's very cool. You don't get a lot of sites like that in Eastern North Carolina. If we're talking about birds that I would think are maybe unique to the area, we get quite a bit of yellow chats out there. Common nighthawks will nest at the sites. We've seen, I'm blanking on some of the good ones. We've seen sedge wrens out there, king rails. What was that? Tons of prairie warblers. Oh my gosh. Bitterns, yeah.
I was going to ask, have you ever seen a harrier out there?
There are lots of harriers out there.
Yay.
There was actually a harrier that stayed all through last year. So we saw one carrying a stick. She looked like she might have been nesting, but it seems kind of far south for them, doesn't it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't want to hog up the questions, but we do have a question. What is the diet of the Eastern Henslow, and how does that compare to a more Western subspecies, and does it influence their beak size?
Yeah, that's one of the going hypotheses, is that the birds that were occupying salt marshes maybe relied more heavily on like small crustaceans, just like a slightly different type of like insect, for example. At the western birds, on the breeding sites, I believe they're pretty reliant on, is it Lepidoptera? You know, like caterpillars and stuff. So they eat a lot of bugs on the breeding grounds because it's high protein. On the wintering grounds, they all tend to eat a lot of seeds, like grass at different sites. Yeah, we've seen mostly bugs. Yeah.
2 questions.
Yeah.
One is, what is the acreage size of each of the 2 properties? Second question is, what are the types of grasses that they?
Yeah, so 2 great questions here. The first being, what is the size of the VOA site or both VOA sites? I guess I could try to click back to my map. Maybe that would be a good image. So the game lands where we did the bulk of our work is, what did I say in hectares? 1,200 hectares. So about 3,000 acres.
Okay.
For unit or for the game land. So site A. Site B is just a little bit smaller. Oh, my map is like really far up here. There we go. Site B is a little bit smaller. It's closer to 1,000 hectares or 1,100. So I don't know my conversion. That's 2,700 acres maybe. And then the other question was, what grass species do the Henslows like? So that's a really interesting question. I don't know my grasses very well. I'm a birder. Right? Well, what we found at the nesting sites, so the grass clumps that the birds are nesting in, it's predominantly wiregrass. I forget the name. Aristrida stricta. Thank you. So wiregrass here in North Carolina, that's a southern grass species, right? So the range of that only really comes up this far. We're like at the northern extent of the wiregrass range. The reason I mention that is because we're at the southern extent of the Henslow sparrow's breeding range, right? So there's this really interesting overlap where our birds in North Carolina are nesting in a grass species that doesn't exist out west. So I think, I don't know, they seem to really like the wiregrass because that was like 80% of our nests were found in wiregrass. It's like really thick and provides really dense cover for them. But we also found, oh man, I don't know my grass species. Panic grass.
Blue stem and
Yeah, there was
grass,
blue stem out there.
said,
There was one, it's a very long name. It's like some kind of panic grass or something. Yeah, that was pretty common. And then toothache grass. I don't know the scientific name for toothache grass. So when you chew it, it makes your mouth numb. Mm-hmm. Did we have another question online?
Yes, there are a few. Let's see. Lily would like to know if the mowing at VOA B occurs before or after the sparrow breeds. And is that a factor that could affect breeding productivity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you were to mow right in the middle of the summer, you would probably mow over some nests. Site B, I don't know the official time that they do the mowing. So you can see on our map, we have the interior polygon is orange and then the exterior is outlined in blue. The interior, they have to mow twice a year because that's where the radio towers are and they're trying to prevent brush fires. They want to keep the vegetation really low near the towers, but the exterior part, they only mow once a year, which is why we found more Henslows in that further area where all of our point counts are. And in my time out there, they always talk about mowing during the summer, but in reality, they always get postponed so much that it doesn't really happen during the summer. So they may try to plan it for June, but it really doesn't happen until like September or October. So I can't say definitively when they plan to do it. It's just that was what I saw in 3 years out there. They've had a lot of trouble getting contractors to mow that whole site because it is a huge area to cover. Takes a lot of mechanical power.
Yeah. I don't know if there are any more questions in the room, but the one last question was kind of asking about man-made habitat And clearly that seems to be where the sparrows like to inhabit here in North Carolina. What does that look like kind of in the other parts of the country where they tend to stay? Is it a mix of man-made? Is it natural prairie?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this is something I was just writing about the other day in my dissertation, because these birds in North Carolina are really relying on what we call substitution habitats. So they're not naturally occurring necessarily. They do require human intervention to keep it a grassland. In a lot of studies of Henslow sparrows, these birds are occupying sites that are man-made. So they're like reclaimed coal mines. Their sites managed with fire. Sorry, I'm trying to get to my range map here. There have been a lot of studies in like Ohio and Pennsylvania of reclaimed coal mines in particular, that these birds will occupy. So yes, they do occupy natural grasslands as well. I just think there are a lot fewer of them and they're maybe smaller in size. So where these areas that are man-made tend to be larger, and they can stay larger because of human intervention. But so yeah, you'll find them in natural and man-made, but the sparrows seem to really like the man-made ones too. And we have a question in the room.
I have mentioned this already, but for BOA site creation, historic evidence,
Yeah, so the question is, before the VOA sites, is there any evidence that Henslow sparrows were occupying parts of North Carolina, you know, hundreds or longer of years ago? And yes, I mean, I know that there are historic, well, what I call historic records of Henslows that occupy parts of North Carolina, going back to like the 1930s, the 1920s. They were more widespread in North Carolina, you know, a few decades ago. It's only been the past like 4 or 5 decades that we've really only found them in the coastal plains, like in these 2 sites. So they were breeding season records. I would assume they were probably nesting there. I don't know a whole lot about the history of grasslands in North Carolina, but one paper I read indicated that natives in this region used to burn the habitat a lot. So it wouldn't be surprising if they were actually unknowingly facilitating grasslands for species like Henslow sparrows in different parts of North Carolina.
Just a lot of mobile garden happened to come up with specimens that probably
Oh, wow. So John was just filling us in that some of the museum specimens date back to 1900, 1901, and that there were definitely more widespread like upland prairie type habitats throughout the Piedmont region in North Carolina.
It seems like if they like to breed in firegrass, it seems like we could expect to see them in mature home savannah.
Yeah, so that's a really great point. In the room, someone mentioned that you would likely find Henslows in longleaf pine savannas because they like that wiregrass species. And that's true of the wintering grounds. So that's where they winter along the Gulf Coast. They love the pine savannas. It's like a different type of grassland with a few more trees, but it's pretty open as well. Yeah, to my knowledge, this is one of the only breeding areas where they breed in wiregrass, but that you'll find them in wiregrass in other places.
all, so they don't use the on its savannah.
Yeah, so the question is maybe why don't they nest in pine savannas when, you know, it seems like it's suitable habitat, it just has more trees? That's a great question. I'm not sure I could answer that. I think maybe risk of predation could be higher in a habitat like that, or maybe more competition from other sparrows. Yeah, I don't know. You would think that they would maybe occupy sites like that because they seem very resilient as a species and they're effective colonizers as far as we've seen. So there's just something about those big trees that they don't like, but they do like smaller perches. I mean, if you go to the Voice of America Game Land, it's not just like a really short grassland. There's quite a bit of shrubbery and lots of stems that these birds will perch on. No, there's not an upper story for sure. There's not like a large canopy, but there's definitely some taller trees. And I've seen Henslows perched on like an 8-foot, 10-foot tree in that field. So they'll use it if it's there. Yeah, John?
I did the first act. But it- Smells and stuff. They were in really young place. Always just 1 or 2 birds. Back at the finding that I don't know if that's really what one. And other people reported the same thing. But early clear kind of time span of right over the tree were only 3 or 4 years old.
Mhm.
And pretty quickly they age out and the birds are gone. You go back and look at it. They liked it little staff and they didn't like it once it got. And they were never more than a few birds in one of those. They are a prairie bird, I think. And why they're here in the east and what they, I don't know, but I'm not surprised you didn't find any 20 minutes. Because those historic sites are not the same knowledge, but I would. So I would find that the next year they went in the same spot now.
Yeah, so John just brought up a really good point that, previous atlasing attempts would maybe find a few Henslows in North Carolina in clear-cut pine stands. So places where maybe the trees have started growing and they're, 4 or 5 feet tall at most, like saplings at best. And you would find a few Henslows, but then the next year you wouldn't find them again because that site is no longer suitable for them. That's not really the habitat that they're looking for. It's an interesting point because as we're synthesizing all of this data, we're actually now wondering if the Voice of America sites are acting as aggregators. Like they are just such nice sites for these birds that the other birds are like, yeah, we don't need to try with the pine stands. We don't need to go to these clear-cut pine logging areas. Because that's what we did in our second year of the acoustic sampling is we searched clear-cut pine stands. There's a lot of Weyerhaeuser properties surrounding the VOA sites. So there's a lot of neighboring fields that in theory would be suitable. And they align with historic records of Henslows that have been found, perched on like 8-foot trees nearby, but we didn't find any out there. And I think it's just because the VOA sites are just so tempting. And the Henslow sparrow also has this reputation of being like loosely colonial is how they describe it. So basically they want other Henslows to be at the site for them to know that that's a good site. So, even if the whole field is open, Henslows will probably start setting up shop next to each other because they think that that's the better site to be in. I guess they trust their neighbors. Did we have any other questions in the room? How about online? Are there any others? All right. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for spending your time with us,
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you guys for coming.
sharing your expertise. Any other final announcements, anything like that? No? All right. Well, we will see you all next month, and thanks for joining us online today. I'm jealous that you guys got to stay dry.
If it helps you, it stopped raining by now.